What happens when loyalty, legacy, and survival collide in a world where every move is watched, judged, and remembered? And more importantly, does success truly free you from your past, or does it quietly tighten the chains you thought you broke? To understand what unfolded in early 2026, you have to look beyond the surface. Because this wasn't just about music. It wasn't just about streams, charts, or industry moves. It was about perception, history, and the invisible lines that people believe should never be crossed. And it all started with a song. On February 13, 2026, a release shook the hip-hop landscape in a way few expected. When Rooms dropped, bringing together Chief Keef and NBA YoungBoy under the production of Mike Will Made It, it immediately dominated conversations. Fans rushed to listen. Social media lit up. For many, it felt like a powerful moment. Two influential figures from different eras and regions finally sharing a track. But beneath the excitement, there was tension. Real tension. Because for those who knew the history, this collaboration didn't feel random. It felt loaded. So the question becomes, can music ever really be just music when the past is still unresolved? To answer that, you have to rewind to a night that still echoes through the culture. November 6, 2020. Atlanta, outside Monaco Hookah Lounge. It started like so many confrontations do, words exchanged, egos clashing, energy building. But in a matter of moments, everything spiraled out of control. What could have ended as another argument turned into chaos. Gunfire broke out. People ran. Confusion took over. And when it was all over, one life was gone. King Von. Only 26 years old. Rising fast. Building momentum. Telling stories that resonated deeply with his audience. His death didn't just shock fans, it left a void. A feeling that something significant had been cut short before it could fully unfold. But the aftermath raised even more questions than answers. Timothy Leaks, known as Lul Timm, was identified as the shooter. His association with NBA YoungBoy's 4KT group made the situation even more complicated. Lines were drawn instantly, not just between individuals, but between entire circles, fanbases, and communities. And yet, years later, the legal system told a different story. In August 2023, the case against Leaks was dismissed. No trial. No conviction. From a legal standpoint, the matter was over. But here's where reality becomes uncomfortable. Does legal closure automatically bring emotional closure? Does a dismissed case erase the pain, the anger, the unanswered questions? For many, the answer is no. Because in situations like this, truth isn't always defined by paperwork. Sometimes, it's shaped by perception, by loyalty, by what people believe happened, regardless of what can be proven. So when 2026 arrived, and that collaboration dropped, it didn't exist in a vacuum. It carried all of that history with it. Chief Keef stepping into the studio with NBA YoungBoy wasn't just seen as a business move, it was interpreted as a statement. But was it really? Or was it simply the natural evolution of an artist who had already distanced himself from the environment that once defined him? This is where things get complicated. Because public perception often simplifies relationships that are far more complex in reality. Many people grouped Chief Keef together with O'Block, assuming a unified identity, a shared loyalty that should remain unbroken. But the truth is more nuanced. Different blocks. Different affiliations. Different internal dynamics. Yes, there were connections. Shared history. Overlapping stories. But they were never one single entity moving as one. And that raises a difficult question. How much loyalty is owed to a past that was never as unified as people believe? Looking back, tensions between individuals connected to these worlds weren't new. Reports from as far back as 2014 suggested conflicts involving Chief Keef's property and people linked to other factions. Nothing was ever fully proven in court, but the existence of those stories added another layer to an already complicated relationship. So ask yourself, if there were already fractures beneath the surface, was this moment in 2026 really a betrayal, or just an inevitable outcome? By the time King Von rose to prominence, Chief Keef had already changed his environment. He had relocated, built his career on his own terms, created distance, not just physically, but mentally, from the day-to-day realities of Chicago's streets. From his perspective, the past may have been something he had already moved beyond. But for others, that past was still very much alive. And that difference in perspective is where conflict begins. When rooms hit the internet, reactions weren't just divided, they were emotional. Some saw it as growth, a sign that artists could move beyond old divisions and create freely. Others saw it as crossing a line that should never be crossed. And then came another layer. Lul Timm himself began speaking publicly. Through interviews and appearances, he didn't just defend the collaboration. He dismissed the backlash entirely. He framed it as independence, as business, as the right of artists to make their own decisions without being bound by expectations from the past. But his involvement changed everything. Because now, the conversation wasn't just about two artists collaborating. It was about symbolism. About what it meant for someone directly tied to such a controversial event to publicly support, and even amplify, that collaboration. And for many, that felt like more than just commentary. It felt like provocation. So here's the uncomfortable question. When someone speaks from a position tied to unresolved pain, does it automatically carry a deeper meaning? Or are people projecting meaning onto something that may not have been intended that way? This is where perception becomes powerful. Because in a world where millions are watching, interpreting, and reacting in real time, intent doesn't always matter as much as interpretation. And interpretation is shaped by emotion. For those connected to King Von's legacy, this moment wasn't just about music. It was about memory, about respect, about what they believed should be honored and preserved. For others, it was about evolution, about moving forward, about breaking free from cycles that have held artists back for years. Two perspectives, both deeply felt, both impossible to fully reconcile. And that's what makes this situation so compelling. Because it forces a bigger conversation, one that goes beyond any single artist or event. What does loyalty really mean in an industry built on collaboration and growth? Can you truly evolve if you're expected to remain tied to your past forever? And at what point does survival require you to make decisions that others won't understand? For Chief Keef, the collaboration may have been just that, a decision, a move, a step forward in a career that has already seen multiple transformations. But for others, it represented something much heavier. A reminder, a reopening of wounds that never fully healed. And in a culture where respect and perception are everything, moments like this don't just pass quietly. They linger. They spark debate. They force people to take sides, even when the truth is far more complicated than any side can fully capture. So where does that leave things now? In a state of tension, but also reflection. Because whether people agree or disagree with the choices made, one thing is undeniable. This moment exposed just how deeply the past still influences the present. And maybe that's the real story here. Not the song. Not the backlash. Not even the individuals involved, but the realization that in a world built on history, reputation, and perception, moving forward is never as simple as it seems. So ask yourself one final question. If you had the chance to leave your past behind, but doing so meant being misunderstood, criticized, or even judged, would you take it? Or would you stay loyal to a version of yourself that no longer exists? Because in the end, that is the choice sitting at the center of all of this. And it is not just their choice. It is a question that applies to anyone trying to grow in a world that never forgets, never forgives easily, and never seems to let old stories die. So ask yourself this: when someone connected to a painful chapter from the past speaks out in the present, does it help calm the storm, or does it light the match again? That is exactly why this situation refused to fade away. At first glance, it may have looked like nothing more than another moment in the endlessly tangled world of music, street history, online debate, and public perception. One more post. One more reaction. One more rumor spreading faster than the truth could catch up. But underneath all of that noise was something far more complicated. Identity, loyalty, survival, and the heavy weight of names that carry far more meaning than the people attached to them may want. And that is what made the reaction so intense. Because this was never only about a single song, or a single collaboration, or a single headline. It was about what that collaboration represented to different people. To some, it looked like a betrayal. To others, it looked like freedom. To some, it was proof that old conflicts had not disappeared at all. To others, it was simply two artists making moves in a world where everyone is expected to pick a side and stay there forever. But is life really that simple? Can a person ever truly be frozen in the role the public assigns them? Can they never evolve, never separate themselves from the moment that once defined them? That is where the tension began to build. The moment people started connecting names, histories, and affiliations, the conversation left the realm of music and entered something much more emotional. Lul Timm found himself at the center of reactions that had little to do with melody and everything to do with memory. For some viewers, just seeing his name in this context was enough to reignite old feelings. For others, the bigger issue was not who he was, but what his presence symbolized. And then came the added layer that made everything even more explosive. Lul Timm also hinted at an unreleased track featuring Chief Keef. That single detail was enough to send the conversation into overdrive. Because when two names like that are mentioned together, people do not just hear a potential song. They hear implications. They hear messages. They hear alliances, intentions, and silent statements that may or may not even exist. Suddenly, the discussion was no longer about whether a track had been made. It was about what the track would mean if it ever surfaced. Would it be seen as a creative move? Would it be seen as a challenge? Would it be seen as a betrayal by those still holding onto old loyalties? Or would it simply be two men refusing to let the past dictate every step of their present? No official confirmation came forward to settle the matter, but in the age of social media, certainty is often unnecessary. Possibility is enough. Rumor is enough. A hint, a clip, a caption, a name dropped in the right context. Sometimes that is all it takes to set thousands of people off at once. And that is exactly what happened here. The reactions were immediate, emotional, and divided. Some people looked at the situation and saw growth. They saw artists crossing lines that others refused to cross, refusing to remain trapped inside the stories others wrote for them. They saw independence. They saw people trying to claim control over their own futures. Others saw something very different. They saw disrespect. They saw history being ignored. They saw a line being crossed that should never have been crossed in the first place. And once those two interpretations collided, the discussion became less about facts and more about identity. Because that is what these moments always become. They force people to reveal what matters most to them. Forgiveness or loyalty, progress or tradition, self-definition or social expectation. But here is what often gets lost in all that emotion. A person can be involved in a public controversy and still be more than the controversy. A name can carry history without being fully limited by it. A past event can shape public perception without defining the entire future. That distinction matters more than most people admit. Legally speaking, there has been no conviction tying Lul Timm to a crime. The case was dismissed. In the eyes of the law, he is not guilty. That reality cannot be ignored. And yet, legal reality and emotional reality are rarely the same thing. One exists in courtrooms, documents, and records. The other lives in memory, social media, personal loyalty, and private hurt. That is why even when the legal outcome was clear, the public response never fully settled down. For people who had already formed opinions, the dismissal did not erase what they believed happened. It only created a sharp divide between what the law said and what the public felt. And that divide can be dangerous. Because once people stop listening to official outcomes and start relying only on emotion, every new development becomes easier to twist, magnify, and weaponize. That is one reason why the situation remained mostly contained to online reactions instead of escalating further. The legal result created a boundary, however imperfect. It gave the situation a formal ending, even if it did not give everyone emotional closure. But while one side of the story was settling into legal definition, the other side was dealing with its own pressure. There were serious legal developments involving individuals connected to OTF, and that changed everything. When the people around a situation are already under major scrutiny, the room to respond publicly becomes much smaller. Suddenly, silence is no longer just silence. It is strategy. It is caution. It is survival. And in moments like that, every public word matters more than it seems. Every comment can be dissected. Every lyric can be decoded. Every silence can be interpreted as confirmation. So when the conversation turned toward Chief Keef, it carried a different kind of weight. He was not just another name in the discussion. He represented an artist with his own legacy, his own history, and his own path. That is why people paid attention when he eventually addressed the situation in his own way. And how did he do it? Not with a direct confrontation. Not with a long explanation. Not with a public apology or a detailed breakdown. Instead, he made something very clear. He moves on his own terms. No explanations. No apologies. Just independence. That kind of response says a lot without saying much at all. It is the kind of statement that forces people to project their own meaning onto it. For some, it sounds like confidence. For others, it sounds like defiance. For others still, it sounds like someone refusing to be trapped by expectations that were never truly theirs to begin with. But maybe that is the point. Maybe the real story here is not about who said what first, or who reacted the loudest, or who people think should have stayed silent. Maybe the real story is about what happens when a person decides that the past will no longer define the future. Because that decision never comes easy. It comes with backlash. It comes with confusion. It comes with accusations. And sometimes it comes with loneliness, because growth often looks like betrayal to people who benefited from the old version of you. So when Chief Keef stayed firm in his independence, he was not just making a statement about one situation. He was making a statement about identity itself. He was saying, in effect, that he did not belong to the version of the story that others wanted to preserve. He belonged to the present. He belonged to his own choices. He belonged to whatever came next. And that raises one final question that hangs over all of it. At what point does an artist stop being defined by where they came from, and start being defined by the choices they make now? That question is bigger than this moment. Bigger than any one song, any one name, any one reaction. It is the same question that follows anyone who grows beyond the circumstances that once shaped them. It is the question faced by people who outgrow old environments, old alliances, old identities, and old versions of themselves. Do they owe permanent loyalty to the past? Or do they owe honesty to the person they have become? There may never be a simple answer. That is why the public keeps returning to stories like this. Not because every detail has been settled, but because the conflict at the center of it feels familiar. Everyone knows what it means to be misunderstood. Everyone knows what it means to be judged for moving on. Everyone knows what it means to be tied to a version of yourself that no longer fits. And that is what gives this story its power. It is not just about music. It is about transformation. It is about perception. It is about the cost of change in a world that demands consistency from people who are constantly evolving. You can see that tension in every part of this situation. You see it in the reaction to the collaboration. You see it in the emotional response to the names involved. You see it in the legal distinctions that the public often ignores. You see it in the silence, the hints, the speculation, and the way one small detail can reignite an entire conversation. And you see it in the larger truth that no one can completely escape the stories attached to them. But maybe escape is not even the goal. Maybe the real goal is to stop letting the old story decide the future. Maybe moving forward means accepting that some people will never understand your growth. Maybe it means knowing that not everyone will approve when you step outside the role they wrote for you. Maybe it means being willing to stand alone if that is what it takes to live honestly. That is why this situation keeps drawing attention. Because behind the headlines and the reactions, there is a human question that never goes away. Can a person reinvent themselves without being punished for the past? Can they collaborate, evolve, and move forward without being accused of forgetting where they came from? Can they choose independence without being read as disloyal? Those questions do not belong only to this story. They belong to anyone who has ever tried to change. So when people ask whether this was just music or something much deeper, the honest answer is that it was always deeper. It was about old conflicts still casting shadows. It was about public memory and private truth. It was about the tension between loyalty and self-determination. It was about how one hint, one unreleased track, one public reaction can reopen debates that were never really closed. And in the end, that is why this story matters. Not because everyone will agree on what it meant. Not because every question will be answered. But because it forces a larger reflection. How much of our past should follow us? How much of who we were should determine who we are allowed to become? And when the world keeps pulling us backward, do we have the courage to keep moving forward anyway? That is the real center of this story. And maybe, just maybe, it is a question worth asking before judging anyone who tries to leave an old version of themselves behind.